Great, thanks very much. I appreciate you all for coming out for the webinar today. And we're going to be talking about issues of browser security and some thoughts we have on how to address those. And I think a lot of us have a real love-hate relationship with our browsers. On the one hand, they're one of our main conduits to the internet. On the other hand, they're the single largest source of insecurity into our networks, particularly in businesses, where other kinds of security may be locked down. The browser still remains an opening where all kinds of malware can come into the enterprise network. And so the question is, how do you balance these two needs? Because the browser is really the source of so many good things, right? It's powerful, it's universal, flexible, fun, necessary, and it's really hard to even imagine conducting business in this day and age without access to a web browser, without being able to visit all the websites of your partners, your competitors, your own business. You probably even can't fill in your time card without access to a browser these days. But at the same time, the browser is fundamentally defenseless. And it's defenseless in two very important different ways. First of all, just the browser itself is fundamentally less like a tank than like a trike. It doesn't have resilience. It's vulnerable because, to start with, it's huge and complex. Your typical browser, for example, Firefox, has about 15 million lines of code in it. And they're being updated constantly. There's new versions of the protocols coming out. They're trying to patch it. They're adding new functionality. Right? The feature sets are changing as the different browsers are trying to compete with each other, which means it's an endlessly moving target to try to secure this gigantic monstrosity of code. And that's always a losing proposition. And then there's plugins. All kinds of people can install all kinds of plugins into their browser to support anything from, say, Flash and other types of content, to adding new social media tools or search bars. And sometimes these plugins are outright dangerous in and of themselves. For example, there was one called Superfish, which installed its own root certificate into the user's computer and allowed anyone in the world to get a copy of the secret key. A man-in-the-middle attack against everyone who had Superfish installed. And then all of these things may also have bugs. They're their own pieces of code, probably less well vetted than the browser itself, so they additionally open up new vulnerabilities on the browser. And finally, most browsers are running at least 4 different complete programming languages. So when you go to a page, it can run an application that will execute inside your browser. And even HTML now is what's called a Turing-complete language. You can write any general-purpose program in that language, and it is impossible to absolutely know that that program is not going to misbehave in some way that can harm you. And in fact, there's thousands of different ways people could write programs that would in some way confuse the interpreter, bypass the browser, get out of sandboxes, and do bad things to you. And with 4 of them, especially famously Flash, introducing endless vulnerability risks, the browser is really just Swiss cheese to direct attack. So the second question is, why can't you just defend it? Why can't you use anti-malware or firewalls to try to prevent the attacks against your browser? And so this is the second inherent vulnerability, that browsers are hard to defend using any of these sort of conventional security mechanisms. So to start off with, you could look at anti-malware, but antivirus is dead. That's what the CEO of McAfee said. It's almost impossible to recognize new kinds of exploits. The attacks are polymorphic, they're self-encrypting, there's new 0 days coming out all the time. So trying to hope that you're going to recognize the bad file coming in is almost impossible, particularly because the browser allows so many kinds of files. If you're running a music app, you sort of know the only thing you're going to get is music. If you're using email, you can really restrict the kinds of content that might reasonably be allowed into your network. And you might say, you know what, we're not going to allow exe files through the email. But in most cases, you do need to allow executables and all sorts of other content through the browser. And so that makes it even more difficult to detect. And Firewall really doesn't work for browsers either. Again, with most other kinds of protocol, you know exactly what you're supporting. You're only allowing certain kinds of content in from certain sources to certain servers on particular ports, doing very restricted sets of things. But with a firewall, you could literally be going anywhere on the internet. You might, with reason, be clicking on just about any link, any URL, any IP address, and accessing, quite reasonably, just about any kind of content out there. And so the firewall has to allow pretty much all of those kinds of possibilities, or it totally degrades the user experience. And now the browser's not functional, and our experience is users then start using their own personal devices or bypassing the security of the system because they've got something they either want to get done or have to get done for their own business purposes. I think the problem is almost being like the old vampire movies. The vampire can't come in itself because there's a door and it's not allowed to cross the threshold unless you invite it in. And when you go out and make an outgoing request from your browser, you're effectively inviting the malware in past the firewall and into your local network. And so all this leads to a fairly predictable outcome. You look at just the number of patches in the browsers, and this is in 2014, IE 230, Chrome 415, Safari, Firefox, they all have similar kind of numbers of exploits that are patched, assuming they actually publish the numbers. We see in published reports over 90% of undetected malware comes into enterprises through the browser. And in fact, 68% of all malware comes in through the browser. And that tells you just how much more difficult it is to detect it in the browser than in other kinds of attack vectors, like email. And finally, of all the apps in the world, the 5 most vulnerable applications are all either browsers or browser plugins. And so these things are just really radioactive. But you can't, you don't want to break up with them. You got a good thing going here. So how do you say goodbye to the vulnerability while keeping the utility of the browser? So that's the question that we want to answer. Well, we've developed a security model based around our 20 years of experience building secure tools and communication platforms on the internet. And we see there are 6 core principles. These are our personal prime directives. So number 1, compromise will happen. The applications, any application that's written, will have exploits that can be run against it. So in the case of browsers, you're never going to build a browser with no bugs that will have no 0-day exploits discovered against it. That's just an underlying reality of the world we live in. Detection of that compromise will fail in some cases, and in most cases will come too late to do any good. There's been an awful lot of talk about anomaly detection and various other tools to detect intruders, and that's not unimportant. I mean, after all, we've seen with recent reports on advanced persistent threats that on average, security and incident response companies are seeing the attacker has been in the network for over 200 days. So anything we can do to improve that's good. But still, the detection happens after the exploit, and that's the problem. 3, we believe that damage can be minimized to near negligible levels with the right kind of architecture. So even when that exploit happens, it's not like it's a life-ending situation. It didn't total your car. It's more like you got a small scratch on the bumper that you can buff out. We believe that compromises can be contained effectively. So when that browser or that other application gets hit with some kind of an exploit, you can make sure that it only impacts that one device and doesn't spread, give access to the desktop, give access to your network, your domain controllers, your databases. You want to keep it tightly contained and constrained. And we believe that repair can and must be automated so that when those infections happen, it can instantly cleaned up. It's not a situation of sending IT around to your desk and having someone, hand re-image your computer and restore you back to work, and you lose a half day's work, and the IT guy gets tied up. It's expensive, and during this whole interval, there's an opportunity for the attacker to try to move horizontally through the organization. So it's critical that it be possible to repair these infections almost instantaneously. And ideally, this should be automated, because we know that detection doesn't work that well. You want to be repairing it whether or not you have detected any attacks. And finally, the sixth directive, we believe that targeted attacks are the biggest existential threat to business. I mean, there's all kinds of attacks happening all the time. People are getting phishing attacks. They're trying to install, make them part of botnets. They may be even doing ransomware. But assuming you've got reasonable security, you've got reasonable backups, you've checked the basic blocking and tackling, on the whole, these kinds of attacks are an inconvenience. Whereas if you look at the big attacks, the attack on OPM, the attack on Sony, these targeted attacks against carefully chosen victims can do enormous damage. These are career enders, not for the poor IT guy in the security operations center. This is a career ender for the CEO. This leads to board-level turnover. And the targeted attacks are particularly difficult to defend against because these attackers have the time and the resources to individually craft their attacks against your particular network environment. All right, so what does that mean? What kind of a solution could you try to build to fit this philosophy, this security model? And that's what led us to Passages. So let me walk through how Passages reflects those sets of core principles. So when you're starting out, you've got a browser on your computer in your network, and you want to go out and connect to the World Wide Web. And obviously, that's the baseline scenario. And in this case, your browser's vulnerable, and once the browser gets compromised, your network's toast. So step one, we wrap that browser inside our virtual machine. So now instead of using whatever off-the-shelf browser you've got, you're using the Passages browser inside a virtual machine that doesn't connect to that local desktop. It doesn't have access to the file system. It doesn't have access to any of the other resources on that machine. It's only able to interact, basically keyboard, video, mouse, to the operator, and everything else is locked inside. So that gives you containment against someone trying to spread to the desktop and get access to your email, get access to your files, or whatever else. But that's not the only thing you need to be paying attention to. We need to worry about it trying to spread horizontally into the network and scanning against vulnerable printers, other computers, trying to attack, again, your domain controller or other servers in your network. So we set it up so all the traffic in and out of that virtual machine travels over a VPN tunnel to our cloud. So there's no ability for it to try to connect to a local printer, to try to connect to some other device on the local network. The only thing it can see is that VPN tunnel that exits outside of your secure perimeter. So now it can't travel to the local computer, and it can't travel to the local network. But we're still worried about those targeted attacks, right? Those are the big existential threat. Well, one of the trends we're seeing is towards attackers using targeted watering hole attacks. So you'll go to some website, but the website, which has been compromised, won't attack you unless you are their particular target. And they do this to preserve their 0 days, prevent detection, avoid alerting any kind of security companies that are out there. But when their chosen victim comes along, boom, they infect that computer. And because they've been so stealthy about it, they often get to maintain that for a long time. So our traffic exits out of geopools. These are shared points of presence. The user has a number to choose from around the world. They hide the user's identity. So when you go to that website, you don't look like who you are. And that, I think, is the sort of Tai Chi move. Rather than just resisting an attack, which could be very sophisticated, in this case, you've actually prevented the attack, the targeted attack, from taking place in the first place. So that attack never happens at all. Now, you still need to be able to, in fact, interact with the virtual machine. So we have a local application that runs in the user's desktop space. and that allows it to be set up as your default browser. So when you click on a link, we don't allow the local machine to talk directly to the virtual machine, but that link actually triggers up through our cloud back down the VPN, and the browser inside the virtual machine opens the page transparently. And in the other direction, this is the same path that allows us to securely transfer files from that virtual space to your desktop while ensuring they can't be drive-by downloaded, they can't be accidentally pushed, and allows you to handle printing without ever allowing that direct communication between the browser or its environment and your desktop. But let's suppose somehow that desktop got infected. And let's face it, this is really unlikely because not only is this a hardened environment, it's actually a Linux desktop inside that virtual machine. And almost no one in the world writes exploits against Linux as an endpoint operating system. And we've actually removed almost all of the tools they'd use. There is no shell in there. There's no compilers. All the different programming languages that we can have actually been uninstalled from that image. So it's very difficult to get any kind of a foothold. But let's imagine in a worst case scenario, a bad guy has managed to get access to that virtual machine. Even if we somehow don't notice it having infected it, we're going to automatically blow it up and burn it to the ground as soon as you finish your session. When you close out that last tab, or the administrator can set up a timer for it to automatically reset every certain number of hours. And then we recreate it from a cryptographically signed known good image of that virtual machine on the user's desktop. And you're back to a totally clean site. There's no way any kind of malware or, in fact, tracking cookies and identifiers can survive that refresh of the operating system. But the key is this has to be easy to use. If the user had to go and install VMs and spin them up and then jump in and run a browser inside it, right, we all know no one's ever going to do that. So with passages, the key is it looks and feels exactly like a normal browser, because it really is. Inside that VM, we are in fact running a modified version of Firefox. We've installed our own tools to instrument it, but fundamentally, from the user's perspective, it looks and works and feels exactly like an ordinary browser. They click a link in their email, and bang, Passages opens up and shows the page. They can bookmark things. You know, you can open multiple tabs. You can watch any kind of content, streaming video. The performance is fast enough. You've got no hiccups with any of that. So there's not going to be the usual resistance that you see to security tools that require users to jump through hoops and change their behavior patterns. But we really built Passages for the enterprise. And to start with, Passages is only available for the commercial market because we want to make sure that we have the ability to scale before we open it up to consumers, because we think once we open that Pandora's box, we're really just going to get flooded. But for the enterprise in particular, we provide centralized management, centralized deployment, full user monitoring. Obviously, that won't be in the consumer version. Activity reporting, integration with your SIM systems. It's designed so that a central NOC can deploy it out to entire companies, monitor it, get alerts, control which users have access to what kind of capabilities, delegate administrative roles, and so forth. Really a full enterprise-ready package that's very easy to get onto the user's desktop and easy for the user to accept without training at the back end. So after that, I'd love to get a chance to show you this. So let's roll on to demo time, and I'm going to invite Brent to take the ball on this presentation and show you Passages in action.
Okay, thanks, Lance. Appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so while the focus of the presentation was on the complexities and detailed aspects of security and protection, the focus for the demonstration is really on simplicity and familiarity and ease of use, and how do you tie this in with your daily activities and daily browsing without any disruption of your standard business flow. So as you can see right here, I have Passages open. Passages is a standalone application. It's down here in my tray. And so as I launch that, all of the details and security aspects that Lance was speaking through all happen in the background, and the only thing that the user will actually have interface with is the browser itself. So this should look familiar. It is based on the Firefox browser, and so we have the ability to change tabs as we're working through. We have the ability to hold bookmarks across your session, and so that can tie in with your specific persistent personal preferences. We can include plugins as well, and so we have lists of approved plugins for enabling and disabling, and those will persist across your sessions as well. And really the primary and only difference you'll see from a visual standpoint of Passages is the Passages plugin that we have. And so that's up here in the upper right-hand corner. And as we dive into that, we've got a couple of different options to work through. We have the ability to change the location, and this ties in with the covering of your identity aspect. So as Lance was mentioning, those targeted attacks, when you are online browsing from your own corporate IP ranges, you're revealing your own identity. And through Passages, we're covering that for you. When we're pushing out of different locations, you have the ability to control that. So we'll talk through and give an example of that a little bit later. The other parts of the Passages plugin that are available are Safehold, and this is the secure file download repository. And we'll walk you through exactly how that happens, how we protect your environment, your system, and your network from contamination if you're attempting to upload or download any files. As I mentioned, we have the bookmark persistence, and your history is available as well, and access to an online knowledge base. So within Ntrepid, we all have Passages set up as our default browser. And so what happens when you were to click on a link within either an email or notes or any other application, are you secure? Are you protected? And as Lance mentioned, we're actually going to launch that link within Passages. And so what we have here is a movie trailer. I'm going to jack up the volume here a little bit. And let this run visually. And hopefully you can notice the seamless flow of the video. If there is any hiccup or hitch in it, I'm going to suggest that it's likely through the GoToMeeting. And we do that, and we allow that because it's running locally on the system. So we're minimizing the interference or the resource that it takes to actually run the video. So there's seamless audio video. Obviously that's a daily part depending upon whether you're in the investigation mode aspect, research, operational, or desktop use within the business. And so we want to provide that seamless functionality. It's really important for the user to not have a reason to find a way around. It needs to be familiar. It needs to be easy to use, and it needs to be simple, and Passages provides that. So let's take a look now at Safehold. And this is, as I mentioned, is our secure file download repository. So what we have here is we are actually hosting this in the cloud. And so if a download is attempted, and we're going to open up a file here. So we have a sample Ntrepid PDF. You'll note that we can view it as a PDF within Passages. And if we were to attempt to download this like we would any other document that we're bringing across, what's going to happen is Passages will intercept that file and bring it into Safehold. And that's where we're going to run our background scans on it. We have signature scans in process with heuristics as well. And so we're doing the background scans on that to prevent the infection from contaminating your system or your network. Once that scan is complete, and if the file is clean, it's going to bring it into the home file system here within Safehold. And so I saved this, went through this as well earlier. And so all I have to do to bring this across to my desktop is I'm simply going to double click on that file. And so now, as I go to my downloads, you'll see that the Passages by Ntrepid Secure Browsing Solution has been brought across to my desktop. And Lance explained how that works, so that we're not carrying it directly across and there's no direct communication to the system. But what happens if the file's infected is we'll actually quarantine the file. and the administrator on the account is notified, and it puts it in this quarantine folder. So when I, as the user, attempt to open the file, I'm blocked. And that's to ensure that we're protecting the user, the system, and the network. The administrator has the capability to release the file to the user if they deem appropriate. They can wipe out the file completely and remove it, or they can pull it off themselves and do any analysis that they need to with respect to that file. So as we take a look at passages, again, part of the identity coverage aspect, I'm going to see where we're located today, and Ntrepid controls the rotation automatically for you. We rotate the IP address daily, and today, even though I'm based out of San Diego, it appears as if I'm browsing from Kansas. Some other kind of trails and tidbits along the browsing day, since I've had this open throughout the day so far. If I were to look at the cookies that have accumulated across the day, you can see that it's significant. There's a high volume of cookies. Now, all or most could be clean and not be a worry, but we don't know for sure. So in that instance, what we're going to do when we actually change location, as Lance mentioned, we're actually going to burn down the entire environment. And the VM will be completely wiped out, and we're going to start fresh with a fresh clean ISO and open up a brand new session of passages. So I'm going to go ahead and close out and switch locations. And so what's going to happen is it completely burns the VM to the ground. We're going to initiate a new VM. And once that VM is established, we are then going to open up a VPN connection. And once the VPN connection is established, we're going to restore with a new browser within Firefox all of the custom personal persistent information, the bookmarks that are tied to that instance, to that location, your history. And so as we see here now, it's changed to Atlanta being the location that we are representing in. I'm going to broaden this out so you can see a little bit better. And when we take a look at our preferences again and we dive back into the cookies list, the only things that remain are those that launch at the startup of the application. So all of our cookies from the previous session, the trackers, super cookies, have been removed. And we know we're starting from a fresh, clean instance there. So let's also take a look and see where we reside now, or where we're egressing from. And we've now changed from Kansas to coming out of Atlanta. So again, we are covering the identity of the user as they're going out. We're no longer pushing out your browser traffic through your own corporate identity. You're pushing out through our non-attributable IP addresses. And then the last piece of the puzzle here is our oversight capability. And this tool is called Insight. What we do is we provide visibility to the administrators on the account for user activity, the URLs that are visited, what files are being downloaded, what are the top sites, how often are users online, all their activity. And this user information is all exportable to be brought into your own analytics tools if you like to do your own analysis. Account management activities, so a lot of access and driving available for the administrators within the account. And again, that's just to provide overall visibility for the organization as their users are pushing through, whether that's reliability aspect or just visibility aspect. So one more thing to point out, as we walk through the first location, the North American IP location, we had a tray full of different bookmarks. And so these bookmarks are customizable by location. So with Atlanta, you can see I've narrowed down to just 3 separate. We do that from a perspective of the user to ensure that there's no cross-contamination. So you control which bookmarks persist in which location. So again, really the point here with passages is to show you the simplicity. And so while the demonstration portion tends to be on the shorter side, the importance is it should be easy to use, and it is. It's simple, it's familiar. It's a Firefox browser. We provide you with the ability to cover your identity while you're online, to upload and download without the risk of contamination, and to maintain that visibility of all users across your organization. So with that, we say goodbye to your defenseless browser and hello to Passages. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. I believe you have the ability to ask those questions within the GoToMeeting console.
Great, thanks, Brent. And we, in fact, do have a bunch of questions already that people have put in. A number of people are asking about access to Passages for consumers. And right now, we're not willing to commit to a specific date, but certainly we're looking at providing a consumer version of Passages in 2016. And as soon as we get more confidence in the date, we'll be absolutely announcing that in the blog and on the website and in our newsletters to let everyone know that that's out and available. Someone asked about running Tor inside of it. Passages is really just for running the browser, and so we've stripped out all other software. You don't have access to the virtual machine desktop within the Passages environment. Ntrepid has a number of products that provide more full-featured, anonymous, and secure desktop environments, but they're kind of well outside of the scope of Passages. With Passages, we realized the #1 threat was the browser, and we chose to very narrowly tailor the security against that threat model, and also then make sure that it would be easy to use and accessible to the vast majority of users. In fact, the general use case that we see is companies will deploy this across the entire organization, so everyone's desktop has it on it, and it's set up as the default browser for all of their browsing activities. Because it isn't just the researchers, the high-powered people who are going to get you in trouble, it's the receptionist or the HR person who gets phished and clicks a link, gets compromised, and they often have access to as much sensitive information, and of course they're all on the network and provide access to the soft underbelly of the enterprise. Can the product be used in countries that prohibit VPNs? The VPN that we're using right now is SSL-based. It runs over port 443, so that should go through the firewalls in most countries. However, countries vary, and depending on how aggressive they are and how focused they are on us in particular, we've got a long history of fighting battles with anti-censorship and providing tools like that. So our experience is it's working in most countries, but there's no total guarantee at any given time that some country won't up the bar and really crack down against Passages specifically. The VPN is very secure. We're using certificates. It's not password-based, and we're using high bit length encryption on the VPN itself. So the security of the VPN from interception is very good. It's not like you can do replay attacks or easily capture the token. In fact, the token used for that VPN is one-time use generated once the user logs in through the helper application. So we've really tried to make it many layers deep in the security and make sure that there's not exploits that you can run against the browser inside the VM, or the fact that it's a static VM to take advantage of that. We've made sure that there aren't any secrets stored inside that static file that could be used against Passages in an attack. Someone's asking about the particular VPN we use. It's not changeable. Everything is hard-coded and built into the system. So it's hard-coded as OpenVPN back to our servers. We've found that to be the most stable, reliable, and high performance. We've built a lot of tools with IPsec and other VPN technologies, and that's the one we've found to be the most reliable at being able to go through the most firewalls, the most compatible with networks, and the highest performing. And so we've really standardized on that. but it's not like there's any configuration for the user to do. You don't need interoperability with your own tools. It's locked down to just that one. Now, the reason we put in so much monitoring and oversight for the enterprise is that, of course, this VPN cuts off the ability of a company's firewall to monitor all of their users. So we build the monitoring into the plugin in the browser and make that available to the enterprise. Obviously, that's an enterprise-only capability and would be stripped out of the consumer version. Another question someone's asking is, what are the supported platforms? So as I said, the guest operating system inside the VM is Linux, but Passages runs on both Windows and Mac, and we think that's really critical. It used to be that, and even if you look around, most security tools are Windows only, but with the increase in BYOD, bring your own device, and certainly in the Silicon Valley, we're seeing an awful lot of companies that allow employees to choose the operating system they run. And statistically, we're seeing that when the people get to choose, they're choosing an awful lot of Mac desktops, and that's kind of the red-hooded stepchild of security. So Passages is equally at home on both the Windows and the Mac platforms. And someone's asking questions about how we do the scanning of files in Safehold. So when you're downloading the file, we're actually using several different best-of-class solutions with a number of different kinds of techniques, because we don't just want to, have 4 different companies using signatures, because that would be ridiculous and repetitive. Although you do see people doing that. So we're using things like VirusTotal for signatures. But we're in the process of integrating Cylance, which uses machine learning and file characteristics that are very difficult to hide to identify malware in a static context. We're looking at integrating other technologies that do actual scanning of the file itself to look for executable characteristics that are a necessary part of exploits. And so we'd be able to detect exploits that way. We're looking at integrating very soon a detonation environment so that we'd be able to actually run them in a realistic environment to look for those kinds of malware exploits. So there's a whole list of different kinds of malware detection that we're employing to maximize the likelihood of detection. And of course, that really only applies to things that are manually downloaded, because if there's a drive-by download that gets initiated, it probably isn't going to land in the downloads directory, and so it never even gets synced up to Safehold to be available to download for the user. And even if it does land in Safehold, there is no automated download. The user has to manually initiate that transfer from Safehold to their desktop. So it's impossible for that to happen accidentally, and there's no ability for the website to display any pop-ups that the user would click. Our local app is displaying the connection. It's completely air-gapped, or not quite air-gapped, but separated from the virtual machine so that the user has to want that file and individually request it. And of course, the exploits, because of the Linux desktop, it's extremely unlikely that anything has exploited the browser and the local operating environment to try to install files, and they'd still be captured within that virtual machine as well. As an option for businesses, of course, you can also lock it down to prevent the downloads entirely. So we've had customers with particularly strict security requirements who configure Safehold to block all downloads. And so now there's no path whatsoever for files to the local desktop, and that provides that ultimate level of security. And of course, with all security, there's always a trade-off between usability and security. And I think we've managed to achieve a level here where we're providing really pretty extreme security with almost no impact on user usability. Someone's asking if the VPN will work with Linux or Debian. Right now, Passages, which is the virtual machine and the VM and the instrumented browser as one package, is Windows and Mac only. So we do not currently have a Linux-based application, end-user application for a Linux desktop. Something we'll consider if the market seems to demand that. In terms of costs, the cost information is all available directly on the website. We like to be upfront about that. So if you go to our website, getpassages.com, you'll be able to see all the pricing tiers for the enterprise product. And once the consumer product becomes available, we'll be putting that out as well. And thank you, Brent, for popping that up. In terms of deployment size for enterprise, right now we're selling a minimum of 10 seats. So any group of 10 seats or more, we're happy to support, and that'll be changing over time. But for the moment, we're wanting to make sure that we can, provide the best possible user experience to all of our early customers. All right, and I think there's some longer questions that probably we'll just get back to you on email with. So I really appreciate all of your attending this and sticking with us for almost an hour, and appreciate your attention. I hope this has been interesting, and we look forward to talking with you either by email or seeing you on getpassages.com. Thanks very much. Have a good day.